Everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today, and thank you so much, Dr. Handelsman, for being here with us today. My name is Ashley Lorenz. I'm the chief of the Intelligent Systems Center at the Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel. I also chair the Diversity Leadership Council for President Daniels, which is an advisory body to senior leadership on diversity and inclusion. In addition to that, we have a number of different outreach initiatives. The Diversity Innovation Grant Program is one such initiative, and that's where we fund projects up to $2,500 for folks, really motivated folks like our organizers for today, Dominic and Karen, who I'll tell you more about, to really empower folks to work on issues of diversity and inclusion and make our institution better. So we're here today in conjunction with one of these DIG projects. So I'm going to introduce, read a few notes on Dominic, and then introduce Karen, who will then introduce Dr. Handelsman. All right, so Dominic is a PhD student in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering in the Whiting School of Engineering. His research focuses on creating software written in DNA. He was a participant in Karen Fleming's discussion group and had the idea to develop a department-specific work group on equity in science within the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering. Dominic teamed with Dr. Karen and Dr. Julia Kohler-Lehman, who's a postdoc, and Dr. Jeff Gray to propose this project. He has a BS from UC Berkeley. All right, and Dr. Karen Fleming is a professor in biophysics in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. In 2014, Professor Fleming founded a monthly workshop to discuss barriers faced by women in STEM fields, with the goal of increasing awareness about implicit bias and teaching the next generation of female scientists the things she wished she knew when she started her own career. Professor Fleming is a world expert in membrane protein thermodynamics and is the first woman to be promoted all the way from assistant to full professor in the JHU Department of Biophysics. Along with Dr. Jeff Gray, Dr. Julia Kohler, and Dominic Scalise, Professor Fleming is the recipient of the DLC DIG grant that I talked about and is the coordinator of tonight's event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karen, who will introduce our speaker.
All right, thanks Ashley, and thanks all of you for coming today for this really exciting event. The first thing I saw when I woke up this morning is today is International Women's Day. I was like, what a fabulous day to have Dr. Jo Handelsman visiting us at Hopkins. She's the Associate Director for Science at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, appointed by President Obama. And her office helps advise Obama on implications of science for the nation. They're really advocates for science, as she was explaining to us earlier today. She's on leave actually from Yale University, where she was a Howard Hughes Medical Institute professor and Frederick Phineas Rose professor in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology at Yale. And before that, she served on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she rose to the position of chair. In 2013, she was president of the American Society for Microbiology. So I'm not a microbiologist. I do grow bacteria, but that's as close as it gets. And what I have to say I admire the most about Professor Handelsman is about how she is getting the conversation going about implicit bias that is hindering the progress of women and minorities in the sciences. And I think the most important paper she published was in 2012. It's in PNAS. It's an open access paper on a study that describes discrimination against young women, and it turns out that both men and women faculty discriminate against young women. So it's not just a problem of the men in the power situations. It's a problem for all of us based on the stereotypes that we hold in our society. So the fact that we can have that discussion and that we continue to have that discussion more and more, I think, is really catalyzed by that really important publication. And I'm so pleased that she's here today from the White House to talk about the fallacy of fairness, confronting bias in academic science. Dr. Handelsman.
Well, thank you, Karen and Dominic, for being such great hosts, and to the rest of all of the groups that I met with today. It's been a fascinating day, and I hope that it is useful to the campus in your growing discussion of issues of diversity and fairness. So I bring greetings from the White House, and this is a topic that we talk about quite a lot because we're very interested in raising the level of discussion about fairness and equity and diversity to a national level and figuring out how we can implement policy that will ensure that those discussions are had across the country. And so if you have ideas, we'd like to hear from you, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about the origins of our thinking, the evidence for why we think there is an issue of unconscious bias in academic science, and then a few suggestions of what we can do about it. So I think it's a widely held assumption of many people that diversity is actually a strength. And that sounds like a slogan or something, but it really is a scientifically supported assertion. So what I want to talk about today is, first of all, why do we say it's a strength? And I think particularly in this country, America, which is the most diverse country on earth, it's a strength that we have to be using far better than we are. It's one of our great tools for greatness, and we need to make better use of it. And then I'll turn to the attitudes that we have among scientists about how we live in a meritocracy. And I'll talk about the evidence for bias, and then at the end, some of the actions and policies. So in order to be absolutely great in the coming age, science is critical. There's no question that STEM fields are driving the greatest innovation and economic development in this country. We've calculated, and a report to the president from 2012 suggested that we're going to need 1 million more STEM graduates at the college level by 2022 than we would produce under normal circumstances. So we really have to ramp up our production of STEM graduates. In addition, the jobs even now that are open for STEM majors aren't being filled. And so there are thought to be almost 500,000 jobs in technology that are not being filled by students. Some are filled by foreign students, international workers, and some are just not filled at all. So with all the discussion of unemployment, which, by the way, has plummeted under our current president, in case you hadn't noticed the numbers, and that was not meant as an ad, I promise. As much as we still have 4% unemployment in this country, we also have jobs going wanting. And so there's a match and a gap between the jobs that are available and the training that we're offering. And yet at the same time, we are driving students away from STEM in droves. So 60% of the students who start college interested in STEM and majoring in STEM graduate in another field. And when they're interviewed and asked why they leave, their answers are frankly discouraging, dispiriting to those of us in the field. They talk about the field as being worried about the what and not the why. I mean, how ironic is that, right? The science is all about the why. So we've given them an impression of science as something that it's not. And they also discuss the alienating environment and some of the weed out concepts that faculty bring to their classrooms. That the idea is if you're good at science, you're really, really special, so therefore our job is to get rid of everybody else. And that's the opposite of what our students should be told. Our students need to hear that everyone can do science, which is true. Everyone can do science. It's a matter of teaching them in a way that, that reaches their intellects. And so we have a lot to change, but I think before we can reach any of the goals that we've set of adding 1 million graduates on an annual basis, or the diversity that I think many of us strive for, we have to address some of the most fundamental barriers, and one is the one I'll talk about today, which is unconscious bias. The second reason for diversity, not just that we need more workers, but the second is that we need to increase the rigor and the vigor of the scientific discussion. So the world is becoming more competitive, and to be competitive in the world market, we have to keep America as innovative as it's been, maybe even more innovative, And there is copious evidence showing that diverse groups are more innovative, more productive, more creative than less diverse groups. So these are just a few examples of the kinds of studies, and there are many, many others in lots of different sectors of society. These studies did controlled experiments with groups that were either very homogeneous or heterogeneous, and then they asked the groups to solve problems. And they found that the solutions developed by the diverse groups were more effective and feasible than those developed by the more uniform or homogeneous groups. Another series of studies showed that decisions made by diverse groups are also more defensible. And there are some interesting mock jury studies that show that a more diverse jury won't come up with a different outcome necessarily as the homogeneous jury, but they'll be much more competent at defending their decision. And finally, in industry, there's a long history of evidence of innovation being boosted and stimulated by diversity in teams. And this has been shown in many, many different sectors and at many different levels, from the board of companies to the teams that are developing new technology. So if we need more workers, and we should be getting more diverse in the STEM community rather than keeping it fairly uniform and dominated by one demographic group, then we have to look at some of the reasons why we don't have the diversity that we need. And so, in addition, I should add, to all the reasons that we need more workers and we need a better workforce in terms of diversity, it's also the law. And there are some very beautifully written laws that come out of the civil rights era that tell us that educational institutions need to be fair and balanced and need not to discriminate. And although we've made tremendous progress in avoiding discrimination of a much more explicit and deliberate type, we are still discriminating, which means our work is not done, and we are still inconsistent with the law as a group of institutions. So if you talk to scientists and you say diversity is great, most of them will say that we hire the best, we accept the best, we evaluate data dispassionately, data about people, and therefore we're just getting the best people among our ranks. And these are just some quotes that we've heard over and over. And the "I know it when I see it" is an outgrowth of the "only hire the best." If you say, well, what is the best? Can you define that? An answer one very often hears is, oh, well, I know it when I see it. I can't really define it. That's an invitation to unconscious bias. There's a copious amount of evidence that the kind of bias that I'm going to talk about today is more prevalent and plays a larger role in decision making when people believe that they're not biased and when they don't have any criteria, when they're just going with their gut, so to speak. Going with your gut is an invitation to using bias in your decision making. So perhaps we need to rethink our standards for greatness and think about more criteria than just knowing it when we see it. So there are a lot of studies that test our objectivity and that challenge the assertion that most scientists will make, that we live in a meritocracy, that people who are better get ahead and people who are less effective in science fall out of the system, and that, of course, everyone knows there are flaws in the meritocracy. When their grant isn't funded, of course, everyone thinks there's a lack of fairness, but it's much more fundamental than that. And so what I want to talk about today is some of the evidence that suggests that we don't live in the kind of meritocracy that I think most of us have believed we do. So there are a number of kinds of data that show that we don't have this objectivity. And so I want to go through the types. So the first is observational and correlations. So I equate this in medical research to epidemiology, where you can see associations for things, sometimes on a very large population, sometimes on a very small population, but it's just an association. It doesn't show causality. But it's often the kind of observation that then stimulates a more mechanistic experiment. And then we have model systems. And in medical research, that will often be animal systems. In psychology research, it's usually undergraduates. I'm not making a connection there. But they're using a system that is not out in real life. It's an artificial system, but it's intended to approximate the real system. And then there are real life studies. And I'll talk about each type of these. And these are studies where you do a randomized controlled experiment, but with real people, the kind of people that you actually are intending to test, not the proxies that you might use in a model system. And so this is more like a randomized controlled trial that you would do on real patients who have a real disease to see, for example, if a drug works. So those are the three types of studies. I want to show you examples of each one. So there was a department at a large public university that had men and women in the department, and the chair was pretty convinced that they had a very fair mechanism for assigning raises. The women in the department were not so convinced, and they went to the dean and the chair and they said, we think that there's a problem here. And they said, all right, well, prove it to us. So they agreed with the chair to bring in an outside committee that would evaluate the work of all of the people in the department. And so in the end, this committee gave a ranking to each faculty member. It was a rating system of 4 to 10. And what they found was that for the men, there was a pretty decent correlation between the ranking that the committee gave them and the salary, which of course this committee didn't know, that those faculty received. The higher the ranking, roughly the higher the salary. But when they looked at the women, there wasn't such a relationship. And in fact, it sort of suggested, it's flat enough, that although a very small sample size, that it didn't matter how good the women were or how high their ranking was, they were kind of stuck in the same range for salary. And so whether you believe in the ranking system that they used or not, and whether you think it's a valid experiment, it's a small sample, of course, the main thing is that the relationship, the driving of salaries by ranking is very, very different for men and women. So a problem there. Obviously, one department, 4 women, we can't draw too many conclusions. Then we look across all people in STEM. If we look using the NSF database for STEM workers, if we look at their salaries, and we look, this is people with bachelor's degrees, we find that the salaries for men are 18% higher than, on average, the women in STEM fields with bachelor's degrees. But of course, the concern here is that more men have been in the field for longer than women, so perhaps they're at a higher salary level, the men that are more senior, and there are fewer women at those levels, and so maybe it's just a problem of seniority. So they took out just the group of early career people. So this is 29 and younger. And they found again that there was a gap, and in fact, in the 29 and younger group, instead of an 18% gap, they found a 26% gap between men and women. So in fact, not only is it not getting better, there's a little bit of evidence here that that gap is getting worse. And if you do the math and you calculate over a lifetime, the accumulated loss of income of that kind of gap, it comes out to very, very large numbers, many hundreds of thousands, or in some experiments, it's been looked at millions of dollars. Another study that some of you may remember, it was in Nature journal a number of years ago, was a Swedish postdoc study. And what they did was they looked at postdocs who were getting the equivalent of NIH postdoctoral fellowships. The same thing is in Sweden from their Institute of Health. And people were wondering why there seemed to be so few women in the pool of postdoctoral fellowships, or the successful ones, when they were training women graduate students at a pretty good clip at this point. And so they looked at the committee's notes, and it turned out that the way the committee had made its decision of who to fund was that they gave every person a total competence score. So it was much like the rating we saw in the university department. And then the competence score determined whether or not they got a fellowship. So they tried to figure out, well, what do we think a competence score could be due to? Well, these are people who are just out of their PhD, so they figured the most prevalent data we use would be publications. And so they calculated a total impact, which was a combination of the impact factor of the journal that they published in and the number of publications. And so they then plotted the total impact of each candidate against the competence score that they had received from the original review committee. And once again, you see a pretty good correlation, whether you agree with the basis for the evaluation or not, whether you think impact scores should be used. It was clear that it did correlate for the men quite well with their competence score. But for the women, once again, it's a pretty flat line. And they can have a very dramatic increase in their total impact of their papers and no increase in their competence score. And it would take an awful lot of papers for them to come to the level of the men. In fact, there was a calculation in the paper. They suggested that it would take 3 more papers in a journal like Science or Nature to achieve, for a woman to achieve the ranking or rating of a man, and 20 more papers in a journal like Neurobiology, in a more specialized journal, which is essentially going to be unknown in the scientific world at the graduate student level. So that suggested that, in fact, it was very, very difficult for women to achieve scores that would be in the funding range, despite the fact that some of them had these tremendous total impact scores, very high impact papers. So again, it's a hint of a lack of fairness. And once again, it's one group, and it's in Sweden, so we can't extrapolate, but it certainly is suggestive, along with the other studies, that maybe there's an inequity. So, of course, as scientists, we want the most rigorous kind of experiments we can get. So let's turn to the model systems. The advantages of these are that they're a clean design. You can randomize them, you can control all factors, and make sure that all the variables are the same between your groups except their gender or race. And the flaw with them is that they're often a very uniform group of people. They're typically undergraduates at major universities where social psychology research is done. And so that might not be completely representative of the world at large. So one of the early studies that was done that I think is really interesting, because it's a little counterintuitive in some ways, is rating of verbal ability. And so they gave their subjects a paragraph to read and asked them to rate the verbal ability of the person who had written it. And in one case, they would tell the evaluator that the writer was a man. In another, they'd tell them it was a woman. In one, they'd tell them it was an African American, and another, they'd say it was a white person. And so this is over a large population. And so after they got these ratings, they found the surprising result, at least they were surprised by it, that they got lower ratings of the same paragraph. So remember, there's only one paragraph here. If the people were told that an African American had written the paragraph than if a white person, and it was lower if a man was supposedly the author than a woman. And this plays into some stereotype, presumably, about women being better at verbal skills or something like that. Obviously, there was no basis for this. It was the same paragraph. But there was no question that it was a highly statistically significant difference in the ratings received if the raters were told something about the sex or race of the writer. Another structure of paper, and there are literally hundreds of these in the literature. They've been done for about 40 years. And they're very powerful because, again, they're randomized and controlled. All the variables are controlled. And the only difference is the name on an application for a job. And it's been done with many variations and many different kinds of jobs in different sectors of society, and also has been taken to the next level of promotions, and the same phenomenon is there. And in these, you have usually one, or sometimes you have several candidates to review, And the only difference that the different raters have in the applications that they get are the name on the application. So these are all identical applications. And what was found was when they asked, would you hire this person or not, in every study over this about 4-decade period, all of the evaluators would be more likely to hire the person if there was a man's name on the application. And they tried this with many different men's names. They tried it with giving the evaluators one to review or several to review. And they got essentially the same result. And it's interesting to think about that because over the same 40-year period, there's been quite a diminished effect of explicit bias. So if you asked most of these people if they intended to be fair, and if they thought a priori would they want a man or a woman in the job, they would probably say, as most people do when this question is put to them, that they just want the best person with the best credentials, and the sex of the candidate is irrelevant, and of course they want to be fair. So that suggests that this is not an explicit bias. This is not saying women shouldn't be in the workplace, or I don't think a woman could do that job. Instead, this is something much more subtle, and that's what we call implicit bias, unconscious, where when you tell people that they have applied that kind of bias, they're typically appalled. These are not racist or sexist people. They are people who are applying stereotypes that have entered their brains without them realizing it. So it's an unintended consequence of simply living in the society that we live in. So the final group of studies, because of course you could say, oh, well, those are undergraduates at big universities and that's not representative of all people, are the real life studies. And there are a number of these. These are hard because it's hard to get real people involved in studies without telling them the truth about what the study is measuring, and that, of course, changes your measurement. And especially in some cases with faculty, it's really hard to get faculty to engage in studies. The return rate is very low because they're busy, I guess. But if you can get the data, it's very compelling. And so one study that I find particularly interesting because of its varied results was they sent the CV of a real person, so this was a real professor, at the time that it happened to be a woman, that she was hired by a science department, and to a separate group of people, they sent the CV at the time she was put up for tenure. And she was a star, and she had lots of grants and papers, and she was really quite at the top of her department by the time she got tenure. And they randomized them and put on half of each of the two CVs, they put a man's name or a woman's name, and then sent them to 238 academic psychology professors. That was the field she was in. And what they found was, no surprise, at hiring, the faculty would be much more likely to hire her if she was a man. They would hire the person if there was a man's name on the application. And that's just like all the hiring studies that we've seen. However, what was actually kind of encouraging was that at the time of tenure, there was no effect of gender on whether they would give her tenure or not. And so that suggests a very interesting phenomenon that's been found in lots of other venues. And that is, the more information we have about someone, the less we apply our biases. And so this tells you something, for example, in doing a search. So how do most faculty do serving on a search committee? They go in the day before the search committee meets, and they read all the applications, and they're rushed, and some of them are doing it late at night, and perhaps they're distracted. And then they come to the committee the next day with their opinions. That probably is an invitation to apply bias because they're not getting all the information. They're using only some of the information by doing a cursory analysis. And so if we really want to do fair searches, for example, perhaps we need to have all of the data. We need to be very careful that we are evaluating all the data and not rushing through. And there are studies that show when people are rushed or if they're distracted, you give them some other cognitive task, they will use bias far more than if they're focused and they're not doing a task under pressure. So that is a really exciting result, that by the time she got tenure, her case would have been as likely to be granted tenure if she was a man or a woman. There's enough information. But it wasn't perfect. They asked all of the 238 people who participated in the study to send the materials back that they had sent them, either the CV at the time of hire or the CV at the time of tenure. And they looked at them and found there were lots of notes scribbled in the margins on them. So they began to read the notes and categorize them. And they found that if the person was a woman, or if they thought that they were reading a woman, they would put cautionary comments in the margins 4 times or more more often than if they thought it was a man. And some examples of these cautionary notes. Well, we'd have to see her job talk. Now, in the case of the senior woman at tenure time, they did vote for her for tenure. But there were these questions of what would she really look like? And it's impossible to make a judgment without her teaching evaluations. Perfectly legitimate comment, it's just it didn't occur on the men's packages. And then my particular favorite, I'd need to see evidence that she had gotten those grants and publications on her own. And anyone who sat in enough search committee meetings has heard this comment applied to women, and it's very discouraging to hear it. So this is if you have a star candidate. Remember, she was outstanding, great papers and very visible work and lots of funding. So what if she had been a little bit more in the middle and a mediocre candidate? With these kinds of cautionary feelings, perhaps the faculty wouldn't have voted for tenure in every case that did in this case. So that you have to worry about. Maybe that you'd say, well, she doesn't deserve it if she's not as good. But if they're voting for tenure for the male version, then they should be voting for tenure for the female version. And that's what we always come back to. There's a comment that I heard once that we'll know that equity has been achieved when women are allowed to be as mediocre as men. And that's not an insult to men. It's just saying that when people are in the middle, men get the benefit of the doubt and women don't. And that perhaps we need the whole range of both men and women. Yes?
Do you know the percentages of how many comments came from male psychologists versus female?
Good question. Everything that I'm going to talk about was gender neutral when it comes to the evaluators. So every single study showed that the evaluators' sex did not matter. And that's the same as true in studies of race. And that's the next thing I was going to say. So as much as we see a gender difference with the candidate, we do not see a gender difference with the evaluator. And think about that. That's a very, very powerful discovery. That says that this is something we all do. And that's more evidence that this is implicit, unconscious, not intended. Women are not doing this to other women. Men are not doing this to women consciously and intentionally. So that's actually important, and I think from a political standpoint, a social political interaction standpoint, it's actually good news because it means we all do it. We're all in this together, and this is something we all need to solve. This isn't a matter of pointing fingers at particular people. This is something that seems to be somewhat universal. So I had talked about this kind of work for a number of years, and I found it all very compelling, and there's a lot of material that I didn't have time to talk about, hundreds of papers that build this case. I just gave you a few examples. And as I went around the country talking to people at different universities, I heard a few themes come up over and over, and I wanted to share some of those with you. So one of the comments I've gotten is women and minorities are just too sensitive. Now, I'm not sure what the relevance of that is, but I have heard that repeatedly, so I just report it here. Another comment is that we don't do it here. It's done someplace else. And I've heard fill in the blank with, they do that in Sweden, we don't do that here, if you show them the Swedish postdoc study. Some bizarre comment. I was at Madison. I was a professor at Madison, Wisconsin at the time, And this postdoc I was sitting next to at a Howard Hughes dinner told me that he really was sure that in the Midwest that was a problem in rural environments. Well, if you've ever been to Madison, Wisconsin, you know it's not very rural. But he was sure that people did this in the Midwest, but on the East Coast, no, didn't happen. And then this is a true story. I did a training for the deans at Harvard when Larry Summers was president. And I talked about some of the data, and they said, oh, this is all really interesting. They were great. They were a really fun group, and we had some wonderful discussions. But one of them made the comment that, you know, Harvard is above this. We don't do that here. Like, they probably do it at Yale, but not here. Well, as you might imagine from my history, I eventually gave a talk like this to a group of chairs at Yale. And wouldn't you know, one of them said, they do it up the road at Harvard, but not at Yale. So there seems to be, then another one is the other kind of department. I heard that from chemists who say, oh, it's the economists. Economists have a bad reputation for sexism. So there's a human tendency to say we don't do this. We want to be fair people. We live in America. Anybody can get ahead. People are evaluated on their merits. So we don't want to believe that we do it. We don't want to believe that our next door neighbor does it. We don't want to believe our best friend does it. We want to believe that we're fair. And so we tend to externalize this. And I heard this over and over, and I can address all of those. The one I couldn't, and then I should just mention one other thing that people do is they begin to focus in on the data, and they want to focus in on the quality of the data. And believe me, I wouldn't have picked papers to talk to you about that weren't very high quality, but they begin to focus on details. But the one that I could never answer is we're scientists, so we're trained to be objective, so therefore we don't do this. Now, I predicted that that wouldn't be true because trained to be objective, that's conscious thought, that's cognitive processes. We're talking here about something that goes through a different system into the brain or out of the brain that isn't conscious at all. So logically, it wouldn't seem that training of that sort to be objective with data would make a difference in unconscious bias, but it was possible. The other thing is, we're not that objective. When we do randomized controlled experiments, what do? We blind the samples, right? It's not because we think we're going to be biased for sex or race reasons against our samples. It's because we're going to be biased for other reasons that we perhaps like a certain hypothesis. But there's a reason we do that. We believe that we can have biases, which says that, in fact, other factors do influence our decisions besides the absolute numbers and data. So even though I think there's probably evidence that we're not objective just because we've been trained, we're still emotional human beings, and we admit to having biases in other settings, scientists persist in using this argument. And I couldn't promise that it wasn't true. So I had a postdoc who had done her work in cognitive psychology. And I came back from one of the trainings I had done with department chairs, and I said, I heard it again. They said, we're scientists. We don't do this. And we just knew that we had to do the experiment. So we decided to do the simplest experiment that had been done for decades, which is hiring one person, so you have one CV or resume, and you put a woman's or a man's name on it, period. And that's the paper that Karen was mentioning. So in the study, we had 127 biologists, chemists, and physicists at 6 major universities across the country. They're geographically distributed. And we sent all of these, and half were public and half were private. We sent all of the 127 the same description of the student. So there's only one student here. And we randomly assigned the name either Jennifer or John to the description. And we asked them questions about the student. And the questions included, would you hire the student as a lab manager? Would you think, how competent do you think the student is? Would you provide the student mentoring? And if you did hire them, what would you pay them? And so the answers were quite stark. We found that when the CV had Jennifer's name on it, there was a much lower likelihood of being hired. So John would be hired over Jennifer with a rating difference on a 5-point scale of about 1.0. So it's a pretty substantial difference. When we asked them, would you mentor? The difference was even bigger. Yes, they would be more likely to mentor John than to mentor Jennifer. I will admit that my own prejudices came into play here, and I predicted we would not get this result. I predicted that they'd be more likely to mentor Jennifer because they would have a paternalistic or more protective response to her because she was a woman. Okay, that didn't work. So our predictions are not always right. And then how much would they pay them? And this is now, notice the y-axis, please. It does start at $25,000, but the difference is clearly pretty substantial. It comes out to close to 15% difference in salary. And so, of course, there's no comparison here. They only got one resume, but this is how much they would pay each of them, depending upon their name. So these are biologists, chemists, and physicists at big, very successful top universities. There was no difference among the biologists, the chemists, and the physicists, which we found very interesting because there have been a lot more women in biology for a lot longer than in chemistry or physics. But that, again, speaks to this being a very systemic and cultural problem that has somehow slipped into our brains over probably centuries of acculturation, and it actually has nothing to do with how many members of our department are men or women. There was also no effective age or rank, and again, many people predicted that older people would be more prejudiced than younger people. Again, it's not and that may be true with explicit bias, but it's not true clearly with implicit bias in this group. So the last question that, of course, we covered before with the other studies is, did men and women discriminate differently? And the answer is absolutely not. So the evaluations of John, you can see men and women. We used reverse color schemes here deliberately. You can see the ratings were the same. And when they were evaluating Jennifer, men and women did not differ. If anything, the men rated her slightly higher. Again, demonstrating that this is not a gendered thing. This is not some plot to keep women out of the academy by men who want to have a male community. This is something we all do without realizing it and without intending. And men and women, blacks and whites, every group you might look at, are as likely to do it on average. So a couple of other studies I think are worth mentioning, because since our study there have been a series that show some really interesting results. One of them was Milkman's group at University of Pennsylvania, where they showed that faculty were less likely to respond to a student's email if the student had a certain name, and it was more likely to refer to men or respond to men than to women, and more likely to respond to majority students than ethnic minorities. And these are just examples of some of the names that they used, which certainly conjured certain race, ethnic affiliations in people's minds. And the differences were really dramatic. Interestingly, the group that got the fewest responses were the Asian Americans. And interestingly, the discrimination was substantially more at private institutions. They don't have an explanation for this, but there are a couple of studies that have similar kinds of results. Another study that I think is, for those of us in the biomedical sciences, it really kind of makes you think about our system, showed that about 5% of the biomedical labs produce about half of our assistant professors. So what that says is the assistant professors across the country are coming from a very narrow swath of the labs, 1/20th of the labs. And this is, these are actually all funded labs, so they could have produced as many graduate students or as good graduate students. The 5% are typically among what we call the elite faculty, and they defined it in this paper. This is Jason Scheltzer's work at Harvard. They defined elite faculty as those who either had an HHMI investigatorship, had a Nobel Prize, were members of the National Academies, or had received something like the Lasker Prize or one of the other very major prizes in biomedical research. And so they found that this 5% was entirely in the elite faculty, which says that the elite faculty have a tremendous power over the next generation of professors. So if we're going to focus any kind of interventions to change the way people train graduate students, this might be a place to focus, because they're influencing not just who gets trained as a graduate student, but the next generation of trainers. And interestingly, the elite men have more men in their labs than the elite women. So elite women typically have very close to equal representation of men and women. The elite men have a preponderance of men. So that says that without any obvious discrimination at the hiring level, the people who are filling the assistant professor jobs are more likely to come from labs that produce more men than women, which means that they're going to be disproportionately producing the competitive candidates in these labs that favor men. And it's not, again, a direct discrimination. I would bet you that none of the professors who run these labs say, oh yeah, I only want to hire men. Women aren't any good at science. It's not that. It's so much more subtle than that. And we don't know what the basis of it. But we do know that there are, on average, in elite labs, more men than women graduate students. So I think that last two studies, the responding to emails and the mentoring study, along with the study that we did at Yale on hiring Jennifer and John, have some very serious implications, because I think faculty in the sciences play critical roles in the development of students, and they serve a function almost like a gateway, that if you can't get past the faculty, or if you're not encouraged by the faculty, you don't really have a very good chance in science. And I think it explains a lot of the attrition in science at the college level. If you think about the average student's life, think about how many interactions they might have with faculty over their 4 years. So they're getting, obviously, advising of both the formal type and the informal type. They're provided access to opportunities. So the faculty will often be the ones to determine whether they're getting internships or experience in research, doing research, or other kinds of opportunities. A big one is they're getting feedback on their abilities. And there have been some studies in the K-12 literature that show that teachers respond very differently on average to boys and girls with right answers. They get much more excited about the boy. Oh, that's a great answer, Johnny. Did everyone hear Johnny's answer? And to the girl, they'll say, yes, that's right. So you think of that's 12 years of education, in this case 4 years. If this is true at the college level as well, and we don't know that, I've not seen a study on that, every time they have an interaction with a faculty member, if the women are getting just a little bit less encouragement for even the things they do well, that adds up over time. And we know that students have a very strong need to gauge how they're doing, and they make judgments about how good they are at a task based on the feedback they get. And some of that feedback is grades, and some of the feedback is more interpersonal. And women of the same grade, getting the same grade, will often say they are less qualified than men who have those grades. And so there is clearly something else shaping their self-image and their sense of their own qualifications. And one factor could be the kinds of reactions that they're getting from the faculty. Another aspect is that it's much harder for women to find a pathway that looks like them. And so when they think ahead to the kind of career they want, they will look to people who look like them. and this has been shown over and over, that people need role models to imagine themselves doing a particular job. And I've heard many men say, well, I didn't have role models. I just got into science because I liked it. And again, that's true. That's how it feels. But what we don't remember are all those subliminal messages of all the books we read about male scientists, and those, those little boxes in the textbooks, the little inserts that tell you the story of a scientist. How many of them were about men and how many were about women? All those little cues are telling men that people like you have done this. And to women and several minority groups, there's almost no attention to people who look like them in the training that we give people or the imagery that they're exposed to. For example, in the mass media, on television, there now are quite a few images of scientists in the mass media, but a lot of them are either men, typically white men, or a lot of them are women that you don't want to be like. And that is a particularly frightening phenomenon to me, because teenage girls in the early adolescent years are very likely to turn away from science. That's one of the places that we lose girls from the scientific community. And there's some evidence that they think they have to make a choice between being a girl and a woman and being a scientist. And perhaps if they had more images of successful scientists who also happen to be girls or women, moms, all the things that women do, as well as being scientists, perhaps they would be more likely to be able to envision themselves as scientists. And I think it happens in those early teen years, because that's a time when people are exploring their own sex, of who they are and what their identity is. And they want to be like women at that stage for the most part, and they don't want to have to give that up. And many girls, if you interview them, think they have to give up being a girl in order to do science. So what would the world be like if we saw lots of images of great women scientists on television and in the movies and in art? Perhaps that would begin to change the storyline that girls tell themselves. And if their narrative included women doing science, perhaps they could imagine themselves doing science. So what can we do to change some of these problems that come from unconscious bias? Some of it, I think, is structural in our institutions. One of the things that comes out of bias is institutional rules and regulations and structures that disfavor the minority population, whether it's minorities being women or people of a certain age or a certain race or ethnicity. So some of it is the way that we set up our institutions, and that can be changed. We can change the tenure clock pattern and cycle so that it's a little bit easier for people to have children, and this is all people, but it ends up disproportionately affecting women during the assistant professor years before they have tenure. Those are the kinds of things that need to be changed now. They were set up in a time when all the assistant professors were men, and we haven't gone back and reevaluated whether those systems and processes are actually appropriate for all people. So one of the other things that I find fascinating is how people get away with the bias. What do we tell ourselves that enables us to actually exercise that bias? And there was a really interesting study by Ullman and Cohn, who did the standard hiring study. Who would you hire, male, female, name, or African American and white sounding names? And then they asked, why would you hire them? So that was the interesting twist. And the result was that in every case in this experiment, they'd be more likely to hire the application with the man's name on it. But they had two versions of the application. One of them had a person who had a lot of experience out in the field for this job. And the other one had much less experience but had a lot of education. And so they did the randomized experiments so that some people would get one type of application with a man's name and other people would get it with a woman's name. And what they found was that whichever application had the man's name would have whatever characteristic it was that they valued. So if the man's name was on the one with more education, they'd say, oh, you have to have a lot of education for this job. And if the man's name was on the one that had more experience, they'd say, experience is prime. You've got to have experience for this job. And so that's the kind of after-the-fact justification. That's how we get away with it in our own minds, because we don't want to believe that we're making biased decisions. When we make a decision, we say, well, why did I make that decision? This is an example of how our standards or the reasons, the criteria for a decision can be a little more fluid than we might think. So they did the experiment again, and they asked people, new set of people, to make a list of criteria. What do you think is needed for this job? And then they redid the experiment, and they found that in most cases they were able to abolish the bias, if not completely, then close to it. So that says that, in fact, we can hold ourselves accountable, and we can do it honestly if we think ahead of time, without a CV in front of us, without a candidate, a male or a female or any other group in front of us. We can think about the abstract fairly and say, these are the criteria, and then line up the candidate's qualities to those criteria. So that's a hint for anybody who sits on search committees, that there really are more effective and less effective ways of being fair on search committees. So there are a number of other examples of things that have been tried to change bias, and there aren't a lot, but they're getting to be more and more. So one is a board game that was developed by a group of academics that allows you to advance in academic science based on various things that happen. And different things happen to the males and the females. And it's very vivid that these little differences between men and women affect cumulatively who wins the game. And they showed in this one study that it had a particularly large effect on men understanding how these little death by 1,000 cuts, you might say, these little events can add up to pretty substantial differences in outcomes. Another thing we could do is blind reviews. The journals that have done this, not the ones listed here, have found a dramatic increase in papers accepted that are authored by women. So an ecology journal ran this experiment for 6 months. When they went to blind reviews, so the reviewers didn't know the sex of the person writing the paper, women's papers increased in frequency of acceptance by about a third. I think that we are, again, issuing an invitation to bias with what we do in the two-tier review, where there's a cursory review, usually based on an abstract or a quick read of a paper, often by an editor who might not be an expert in the field. And then the decision is made whether to forward that paper for a full review. And I think the full review system is much fairer because we have to justify the decisions that we make. Every comment that we make about a paper, presumably for a good review, has to be justified and explained. But in that first gut level review, that first level of making a decision based on an abstract or a quick read, we're going with the gut again. Remember the comment, I know it when I see it. That's all we're really asking for. This is either in or this is out. How do we avoid bias when we have that little information? And all of the evidence is less information leads to more bias because that's what we always have, independent of information. So that's a hypothesis. I don't know. But I have talked a couple of times with editors of some of these journals and asked whether they'd be willing to do the experiment for some period of time and try doing that first level of review in a nameless way. There's also some evidence that going through the data and talking about the evidence for bias can actually have an impact on people's ability to avoid the bias. And so one study at the University of Wisconsin showed that when they trained faculty in faculty meetings in unconscious bias, by teaching them the literature, going through some papers with them, they found over the ensuing 6 months that hiring of women increased And they also found in some cases that fellowships were distributed differently, and there was a better climate in the department for women. Another line of evidence is that we can be primed to be more fair by what we've seen. And so one study showed that if you put vivid images of either positive or negative representations or examples of African Americans or whites, you could change the outcome of a evaluation, a hiring evaluation that was done right after that. But the effect only lasts 24 hours. So you could show people 5 examples of very powerful, positive African Americans. They'd be more likely to hire an African American, but that doesn't last. So how do we make that last? Well, one of the things I always see in universities is these vast expanses of empty wall. So what if we used those to paint murals, or we did statues, or something else, of men and women, blacks, whites, Asians, every group that we might have represented in science, if we had a truly representational group of scientists, have them have representation in our art. We don't have to have it in real life to be able to imagine it in art. Or represent real live scientists who are diverse, who have been through our universities. I was mentioning earlier that Yale University trained and educated the first black PhD in physics in the United States. Well, I think that's something that should be on every wall in every physics classroom. How could you have a physics major not know that Yale had done such a landmark thing in the 1800s when nobody was training blacks in the hardcore sciences? And that was a really landmark thing and should be celebrated. But you don't see it talked about very much. Why not use that, lift up those examples? And I know there are similar examples here at Hopkins. And then finally, there's some evidence that if we discuss bias and we try to hold ourselves accountable, we can be more fair. And I hope that we get someday to a place where we can have the conversation and ask the question, are we being fair? Are we holding Jennifer and John to the same standards? And not have people go nuts on us and say, are you accusing me of bias? And get really defensive, because that's what happens when you say that now. It's very hard to ask a search committee, are we sure we're being fair, without getting a pretty violent reaction. So if we accepted that we're all biased, so this is something we're asking of ourselves and everyone else, and it was just part of the process, that we go back and review our work and say, okay, did we hold everybody to the same standards? Are there any inconsistencies here? Perhaps we could root out some of the bias in our decisions. So there are a number of efforts at the White House I can talk about offline that are addressing some of the elements in academic science that have discriminatory or potentially discriminatory features. So one is we're working very hard on the way that STEM is taught. And so if we change the way we teach, we can hopefully increase the representation of women and minorities. We can also benefit white men, but we can equalize and level the playing field a little bit. And so one of the things that we're doing there is supplying funds for active learning, and the president's last budget had $60 million for the First in the World competition, and that had stressed, highlighted active learning. And then we have a committee working on bias and asking what should we be doing in the federal agencies to address the bias issue. Should we be training within federal agencies? Should we be doing some other kind of modification of behavior through knowledge? And that committee is in process now. And then finally, we are responding to the interest from the mass media in representing STEM more accurately. And so we've been in conversations with people who write and produce television and movies, and they say, you know, we don't know the stories of scientists and engineers and technical people. We need to know those because, you know, we can't write about something that we've just never seen. And so what we'd like is to be able to make those stories of scientists that are as fascinating as we all know they are, available to writers, producers, directors who are choosing themes for either television series or even walk-on parts. It doesn't even have to be a series about STEM. It could just be a STEM person who happens to be a woman or a minority passing through a story. So that's another area where we're working. And there's really tremendous response from the writers in particular who are very eager to use their craft to modify images of STEM and men and women. So I hope this brings to light some of the research in bias, convinces you that this is something that we all do, and it's not something that any of us is, in my opinion, allowed to walk away from. There's a responsibility to induce the kind of system that we used to imagine we had. Most of us thought we did live in a meritocracy and that people got ahead not because of their skin color or their sex, but because of how good they were. And now we know that there's plenty of evidence that there are other shades of evaluation that are going on in a much more subtle way, and we have to guard against those if we're truly going to generate the best workforce and the best STEM community that we can, and use the diversity that's out there and evaluate it fairly. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions you have.
We have time for a few questions, and I also want to invite everyone to a reception out in the colonnade. No question? There we go. Henry.
I had a question. So you discussed that it's difficult at the during the hiring process to bring up the question of being fair. When you're bringing up the question to somebody of a different generation, how do you spark the conversation of this fairness without appearing like being discreditory? Saying rather than okay, well you've benefited from this in a more engaging way.
Yeah. Yeah, you hit on a really serious issue, that people who have benefited from what we might put in its most extreme version call white male privilege don't want to think that they've been privileged. And when I was at the University of Wisconsin, I had a postdoc who studied this and did very in-depth interviews on the concept of whiteness with faculty from across engineering and biology. And what she found was that people believed that there was bias against non-whites, but they didn't think there was any bias in favor of whites. And when she suggested that, and suggested that if one group is being disadvantaged, another one must be advantaged, they would get typically very angry. That was the most common reaction, and didn't want to believe that they had gotten where they got based on anything except the quality of their work and how hard they worked. So that's an issue. You're absolutely right. It's much easier to accept that we might be biasing ourselves negatively against a group than to accept that we ourselves are the beneficiaries of bias. And I think that's just something we have to work on and realize that it doesn't mean that the people who've gotten ahead aren't fantastically competent and that they didn't get an enormous boost or a free ride. Many of them work quite hard, but help them understand that there are other people who are working hard and are just as talented who aren't getting that benefit of the doubt that we talked about. But you're right, that's the toughest issue, I think.
Are we doing some students a disservice to encourage them to go into STEM in the current funding environment?
Well, there are a lot of answers to that. Really good question. The first is there's an enormous deficiency of STEM workers at the bachelor's level. So the data that I was talking about, needing the 1 million more workers, that's bachelor's level. So at that level, there's no question that industry is starving. I mean, we talk to industries, and many of them will say they're moving their research facilities out of the United States because they can't hire enough people. So that's a biggie. However, at the PhD level, we obviously don't have an excess, at least an excess of jobs, at least in academia. We also don't have an excess of funding, although I just want to note that there was a tremendous increase in the NIH budget this year, so hopefully that will allow a few more people to go into STEM fields and be funded. But I think what we do wrong is that we encourage people to go into STEM fields with the promise or expectation that they're going to be faculty. And in fact, a very small percentage of our graduate students actually do become faculty, but they're employed, they have great jobs, and they're bringing the rigor and the thought process and the concepts that they learned as a STEM professional in graduate school to whatever job they're doing, whether it's science writing, whether it's teaching at a different level, whether it's working on Wall Street. It's valuable to society to have PhD scientists in all of those roles, and many others, like sitting in Congress. I think it'd be great if a few senators and Congress people had PhDs in science. So what's wrong with training a lot of STEM majors that won't be professors? What's wrong with it now is that we don't talk about the other careers very often. And I think we need to incorporate that into the training so that they're more prepared for those careers and they know how to write for broad audiences, or they try out working in industry. Make that a normal part of graduate education so that they can imagine what these other jobs are. Because many of our graduate students have only seen one STEM job, and that's us. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm a STEM graduating, so I kind of know, if my friends got a job or not based on whether they were biologists or physicists or chemistry majors. And it seemed like the only industry in STEM that really there were jobs was computer science.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk about, like, when we say STEM, when we say jobs, and we say there aren't enough of them, are there enough people to fill the jobs? Are we mostly talking about computer science? And is that, I was wondering if you could touch upon like how that affects your policy in the market.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Is it just computer science? And right now, you're right, the 500,000 jobs that are open are largely tech areas and computer science. But it's other industries as well. And there was a really interesting story on NPR a few years ago where they interviewed manufacturing companies and other STEM-related fields around, I think it was the state of Connecticut. And they heard the same thing over and over, that all we want is STEM qualified people. We want people who can count, who can do quantitative work and think rigorously and work in teams and work independently and be creative. We don't care what field of STEM they're trained in. And none of these were computer companies. They were all sorts of, from the health insurance industry to manufacturing. And so I think that's an example of where there is a STEM industry out there that needs workers. It's not just computer science. But it doesn't matter what the STEM fields are. So sometimes people say, well, there aren't jobs for physicists out there necessarily. There might be jobs for computer scientists or for engineers. In fact, what industry says is they don't care as much as at least I thought and my students all thought a few years ago, that they wanted to hire a person with a particular set of skills. The industries typically say, we're going to train them in what they do here anyway. What we want is the thinking process, and what you do in universities is train them to think. So the answer is yes, a lot of it is tech, but definitely not all of it. And in fact, one of the fastest growing sectors is healthcare, and a lot of that is biological and physical sciences and engineering, not necessarily tech.
Yeah, I would like to know what is the core of the bias in the science field? Is it from the area where the individual comes from or their upbringing?
That's a really good question. I don't think we know that. So we know from the experiment that my group at Yale did that geographically the results were the same across the country. So universities in the South had the same biases as people from universities in the North, and East and West the same. There is some evidence that other countries apply very similar, people in other countries apply similar biases, but there's a lot less work outside the United States. And there hasn't been an awful lot of work within, breaking down smaller groups of different backgrounds within the United States as the evaluators. So that's what you're asking, people of different backgrounds?
I was asking what is the core of the bias. For example, I'm an African American, and you don't find too many African Americans in the science field.
Right.
So I'm thinking that the core of the bias is the upbringing of the individual, of the hiring, who hires the individuals at the time. I'm thinking that is their upbringing, that they have this subtle bias.
I think that it's maybe upbringing, but it's across all sectors of upbringings, if you know what I mean. That people from many different backgrounds in the United States who were brought up very differently all seem to share this bias. And I think there's some evidence that it starts at about age 2, you can start picking it up. So this is very early, and I don't think we know enough about it to say where it's coming from. But another thing that you kind of alluded to is the bias of the individual themselves. And that's a whole area of research that I didn't have time to talk about called stereotype threat, where individuals are, that when you activate stereotype threat, you induce a tremendous anxiety about them representing their group. So if they feel that they're just representing themselves, they're much more relaxed than if they're either taking a test or going into an interview and feel that they're representing all women or all African Americans or all Hispanics. And you can actually see the effect of this on an MRI, because when you activate stereotype threat, you see blood flow from the cognitive part of the brain to the emotional part of the brain. So of course, you're not going to be able to do as well on a test or in an interview if your cognitive functions aren't fully oxygenated. So that's where we can get stereotype threat and bias right down to a physiological level and understand what happens when an individual feels threatened because they're being thought of first as an African American or a woman or a part of another group, rather than as a scientist or as a professional. Does that help? One more?
Yeah, let's take one more and then we'll move out to the fine. I wanted to ask a little bit about the wage gap. Being a woman in STEM and understanding all of these biases, is there a way that I can advocate for myself? Because outside of a study, I don't necessarily know what my job counterpart is going to get paid. So how can, understanding all of this, how can I kind of use that to my benefit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the main thing is to ask questions. And I think one of the things that can do is get employers or people who set salaries simply thinking about their own values. If they have to say what the basis for setting a salary is, perhaps they'll think about whether your credentials are like someone else's or better. Another thing that I think we need to think about is making salaries public. And so one thing that is very clear is the difference between public and private universities. Public universities have to publish their salaries. Every employee of the university is right there out on the internet. And so it's very easy, you don't even have to be at the institution, to get all the salaries and do sex comparisons. And I've done that with a few institutions. And so you can decide whether there's an imbalance. Now that's academia and it's public. Private universities rarely let their salaries out from the department. Many even keep the department chair from knowing their faculty's salaries. So not only do the faculty not know, but even the department chairs don't know. So there's a very kind of mysterious quality about it. And I think, I'm working for an administration that has advocated open data, with tremendous vehemence in every sector, and I would say it should extend to salaries in every environment, because that's the only way that we can begin to see whether there's equity and not just have to trust an administration to be fair. You can also just simply ask, do it with a sweet smile so they don't feel like you're pointing fingers at them, and just ask, do you pay attention to gender equity in your salary assignments, or what do you do at this institution, whatever it might be, to assure that you don't have some of the biases that are evident in the job market generally.
All right, let's thank